I was born and raised in Leipzig in eastern Germany, where almost no one talks about God. From an early age, I learned that faith was merely an illusion for the weak, a convenient fantasy for those unable to face life's harsh reality. In our home, religion simply wasn't a topic. My parents, both academics educated during the Soviet period, taught me to value only what could be proven, measured, quantified. The invisible had no place in our dinner table conversations. But years later, when I placed my forehead on the ground for the first time, something so intense took hold of me that I still cannot explain it today. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a completely new dimension of existence, a dimension that, despite all my years of secular education, I could never have imagined. How could a convinced scientist be touched so deeply by a simple gesture of prostration? How could a German woman without religion find Allah in the silence of her own room? This is the story I need to share. Before continuing with my story, write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this testimony is reaching. Are there others like me who grew up in environments completely disconnected from spirituality and yet felt this calling? I'm curious to know your experiences too. My name is Clara Hoffman. I'm 35 years old, married, mother of 2 children, and I spent much of my life believing religion was a waste of time. Today, I work as a university anthropology professor in Berlin, where my past and present meet daily. 10 years ago, I would have laughed if someone told me that one day I would be sharing my testimony of conversion to Islam. I was that person who questioned everything, who challenged any mention of faith during academic debates. The irony doesn't escape me. The convinced skeptic found the greatest certainty of her life precisely in what she most ridiculed. Leipzig isn't just a city on Germany's map. To understand my story, you need to understand this place. After decades of communist rule in East Germany, Leipzig became one of the world's most secularized regions. The statistics are clear. About 80% of the population professes no faith. The centuries-old churches that dot the urban landscape are visited more by tourists than by worshippers. They are historical monuments, not places of worship. My childhood was marked by this spiritual silence. At school, we learned about biology, physics, chemistry, sciences that explained the material world. We discussed politics, economics, history, but never the great questions of the soul. It was as if we had collectively agreed that the spiritual dimension simply didn't exist, or worse, didn't deserve our attention. I remember once, at 9 years old, asking my teacher why so many people in the world believed in God. She smiled condescendingly and replied, "It's just a comfort mechanism for those who don't understand science, Clara. When people can't explain something, they make up stories. It's like telling a fable to a frightened child." That answer satisfied me for many years. It seemed logical, rational, superior. Sometimes, in rare moments of introspection, I wondered, if God exists, why does no one around me speak of him? Why can intelligent, educated, and successful people live complete lives without mentioning this possibility once? This questioning never received an answer. It just echoed in the void, a void that, without my realizing, grew within me each year. Little did I know that this absence would be precisely the space where Allah would place something new. Like ground cleared and prepared to receive a building, my heart empty of dogmas and religious prejudices was, in fact, being prepared for truth. At 23, during my doctorate in cultural anthropology, an opportunity arose to spend 6 months in Morocco for field research. I went with enthusiasm, excited to study urban social transformations in Fez. I had prepared questionnaires, methodologies, interviews. I was academically ready but spiritually unprepared for what I would find. I arrived in Fez on a hot September afternoon. The air carried the aroma of spices, leather, and cedar. The narrow alleys of the Medina seemed like a labyrinth from another time. I was fascinated by the aesthetics, the architecture, the pulsating life of that place. Everything was an object of study for me. The people, their customs, their traditions, elements to be observed, noted, coldly analyzed, until I witnessed something that changed my perspective. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was walking through the market, observing merchants, when suddenly I heard a melodious call echoing through the loudspeakers. It was the Adhan, the call to prayer. something I knew theoretically but had never experienced so closely. What happened next left me astonished. Like a perfectly synchronized choreography, I saw men and women interrupting their tasks. Merchants who, seconds before, were negotiating vigorously, now closed their shops or simply left their merchandise under colleagues' surveillance. I saw a young man spread a small carpet on the ground, among baskets of fruit. An elderly lady discreetly entered a nearby mosque. Others sought quieter corners. And then, silence and prostration. Those people, of different ages and apparent social status, united in a gesture of submission and reverence that I had never witnessed. Their foreheads touched the ground. Their lips moved in whispers. There was something in that moment that transcended my analytical understanding. I stood still, observing, suddenly feeling like an intruder before something sacred. I didn't understand what was happening inside me, but I felt a shiver run down my spine. Why did they do this? What was in that gesture that seemed so significant? What was the invisible force that connected all those people in a ritual so synchronized and yet so deeply personal? That night, lying in bed in my small rented apartment, these questions hammered in my mind. For the first time, my academic approach seemed insufficient. There was something more there, something my questionnaires and theories couldn't capture. These questions remained stored, waiting like dormant seeds, until they came back to haunt me years later, when I least expected it. My 6 months in Morocco were productive from an academic standpoint. I collected enough data for 3 scientific articles and much of my thesis. I observed, interviewed, documented. But something had changed within me, a curiosity that didn't fit the parameters of my research. Even so, I managed to suppress it, file it away in some corner of my mind as temporary cultural interest. On the flight back to Berlin, tired after hours of layover in Madrid, I just wanted to sleep during the last 2 hours of the journey. Fate, however, had other plans. I sat next to a young man of Arab appearance, probably in his 30s. He dressed like any European, jeans, simple shirt, nothing particularly distinguishing. We exchanged polite smiles, as passengers do who will share a limited space for a few hours. The conversation began trivially. He asked if I was returning home or just passing through. I replied that I was returning after a research period in Morocco. His eyes lit up. He was Moroccan, an engineering student in Munich, returning from a visit to his family in Casablanca. We talked about places we both knew, about cultural differences, about food, those pleasant trivialities that fill time. Until suddenly, after a brief silence, he looked at me with surprising intensity and asked something that no one had ever asked me directly. What is your faith? The question caught me completely off guard. In Germany, especially in academic circles, religion was almost taboo, considered too personal or simply irrelevant. I smiled awkwardly, feeling an inexplicable embarrassment. None, actually, I replied with typical German frankness. I grew up in a completely secular environment. I believe only that something must exist, some force or energy, but I don't follow any specific religion. He nodded, without judgment in his gaze. After a few seconds, he said something that would be engraved in my memory. One day, perhaps, you will discover who that something is. It wasn't a presumptuous statement or a disguised invitation to conversion. It was just a sincere observation, as if he could see something in me that I couldn't see myself. We changed the subject soon after, and when we disembarked, we cordially said goodbye. We never saw each other again. I didn't know it, but those words would be like a seed planted deep in my soul, a seed that would germinate silently, waiting for the right moment to bloom. Back in Germany, I immersed myself in academic routine. I finalized my thesis, began teaching, published articles. Superficially, everything went according to plan. I built the solid career I had always aimed for. I met Thomas, a colleague from the sociology department. We fell in love and married 2 years later. We had our first daughter, Sophie. Life followed its predictable course, but something had changed inside me. A thought that first emerged as a distant whisper gradually increased in volume. What if I die today without knowing who God is? It was an inconvenient thought that appeared at the most unexpected moments, during a class about funeral rituals in different cultures, in the early hours, while nursing my newborn daughter, at parties, while observing people laughing and drinking, seeming so certain of their finite existences. This restlessness was particularly strong when I was alone, as if, in silence, an inner voice could finally be heard. You've studied so many cultures, so many beliefs, but you've never allowed yourself to truly experience any of them, this voice said. You observe from afar, analyze, dissect, but never get close enough to feel. I never shared these thoughts with anyone, not even with Thomas, who, despite being understanding in so many aspects, would probably consider this fixation somewhat disturbing. In our social and professional circle, expressing sincere interest in religion would be seen as almost eccentric, like admitting to believing in conspiracy theories or astrology. And so, this doubt grew in silence, day after day. It became more intense, harder to ignore. It was as if something inside me was awakening after a long sleep, stretching, refusing to go back to sleep. In my second year as a professor, I decided to offer a course on bodily expressions of faith, a safe academic title to study religious gestures from different traditions. Part of me knew it was an excuse, a way to legitimize my growing curiosity. I reread my notes from Morocco, researched prostration rituals in various religions. I became a theoretical expert in something I had never experienced. Islamic prostration, the sujood, fascinated me particularly. Complete physical submission as an expression of spiritual submission. The forehead, seat of intellect and ego, touching the ground in humility. It was such a counterintuitive gesture for someone raised in Western individualistic culture, and yet it seemed to contain a profound wisdom that my intellect couldn't decipher. One night, after spending hours preparing a lecture on the topic, a bold idea emerged. What if I tried it? Just as an anthropological exercise, of course. A controlled experiment, a way to understand bodily what I studied intellectually. It was an ordinary Tuesday in November. Thomas had taken Sophie to visit her grandparents in the countryside, and I was alone in our Berlin apartment. I had planned to get ahead on some corrections and finalize next week's lecture, but that idea wouldn't leave me alone. After dinner, I looked at the empty living room. I felt ridiculous for what I was about to do, but also inexplicably attracted to the possibility. It's just an experiment, I told myself, a way to enrich my academic understanding. I checked the direction. I knew Muslims pray facing Mecca. Using a compass on my phone, I determined the approximate qibla. I didn't have a prayer rug, so I spread a towel on the floor. Barefoot, I positioned myself on it. I felt extremely uncomfortable, part curious anthropologist, part awkward imposter. I tried to remember the sequence of movements I had observed and studied, standing, bowing, kneeling, and finally, prostrating. I hesitated. It seemed like a boundary being crossed, but then I took a deep breath and continued. I rested my knees on the floor, my hands, and finally, my forehead. The contact of my face with the towel fabric was strange, unfamiliar. I closed my eyes, not knowing exactly what to do next. I had no words to recite, no clear intention beyond curiosity. That's when something unexpected happened. Suddenly, I felt a wave of peace that didn't come from me, a profound calm I had never experienced before. It was as if someone had turned off all the noise inside my mind, the constant worries, the incessant internal dialogue, the perpetual analysis. Everything went silent. I remained in that position for how long? A minute? 5? I can't say. When I finally stood up, I felt light, almost floating. My eyes were moist, though I didn't remember crying. I sat on the sofa, confused and fascinated. What had happened? Was it just a psychosomatic response? A placebo effect produced by my own expectations? Or was there something more, something that escaped the rational explanations I had always privileged? I didn't know if it was coincidence or something more significant, but something inside me wanted to feel that again. In the conversations with my new Muslim sisters, I understood that my childhood emptiness wasn't abandonment, but space for truth to enter. My heart was like a blank canvas, ready to receive Islam in its purest form. I learned that the sujood that had touched me so deeply wasn't just a physical gesture, but the perfect bodily expression of a spiritual truth. We are all created by Allah, and to Him we return. Our submission isn't humiliation, but recognition of our true position in the universe. In Islam, we find our freedom in submission to Allah, not despite it. explained Aisha, a university professor like me, converted 10 years ago. When we know who truly deserves our submission, we stop submitting to society's expectations, others' opinions, our own destructive desires. These words resonated deeply with me. My entire academic life had been marked by a constant need for approval, from advisors, peers, scientific journals. It was exhausting. In Islam, I found a simpler guidance: to please Allah. And surprisingly, this submission to a higher authority liberated me from the small tyrannies of daily life. With this new community's support, I found the courage to practice my faith more openly. I began wearing a discreet headscarf, not as a symbol of oppression, as many in the West interpret it, but as a voluntary expression of my spiritual identity. To my surprise, this simple piece of fabric became a bridge to new connections. Other Muslim women recognized me on the street, at the supermarket, on campus, and we exchanged the salam, the greeting of peace, like a secret code of mutual recognition. Gradually, my life reorganized around this new identity. The 5 daily prayers structured my time differently. I stopped consuming alcohol and non-halal meat, choices that initially seemed limiting, but soon became liberating. The mental clarity I experienced after these changes was surprising. It was as if a fog had dissipated. My relationship with my original family remained tense, but began to evolve slowly. Sophie, my then 4-year-old daughter, was the first to accept my transformation without questioning. For her, it was perfectly natural that Mommy now wore a pretty scarf and did that special exercise 5 times a day. Children have a wonderful capacity to accept changes without judgment. Thomas, after the initial shock, began to show cautious curiosity. Although still uncomfortable with my conversion, he respected the peace it had brought me. One night, as we dined, he admitted, "I don't understand your choice, Clara, but you seem more centered, more serene." I can't deny that. It was a small acknowledgement, but it meant a lot to me. I didn't ask him to accept my faith, just to respect my journey. Over time, we established a new balance in our marriage. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Thomas even began to occasionally participate in dinners with the Muslim families who became part of our lives. My parents took longer to adapt. The abyss between their materialist atheism and my new faith seemed insurmountable. But love for Sophie, their only granddaughter, served as a bridge. Gradually, they began to ask genuine questions about my beliefs, not to criticize, but to understand. Small steps, but significant ones. A year after my conversion, I discovered I was pregnant again. I was ecstatic, but also apprehensive. What would it be like to raise this child already as a Muslim, different from Sophie, who was born before my spiritual journey? Thomas and I had long conversations about how to balance the different influences in our family. During pregnancy, my Muslim sisters surrounded me with care. Fatima prepared nutritious soups for me. Mariam brought books about motherhood in Islam. Aisha looked after Sophie when I needed to rest. It was a type of community support I had never experienced before, so different from the individualism in which I was raised. When Amina was born, I chose an Arabic name this time. She was received by 2 families, the biological and the spiritual. At the hospital, my parents and Thomas were present, but also Fatima and other Muslim sisters. The scene might have seemed strange to an outside observer, but to me, it represented the new reality I had built, a bridge between seemingly incompatible worlds. Little Amina grew up hearing the Adhan as a lullaby, but also German fairy tales. Sophie, now older, was fascinated by the stories of the prophets I told her, and proudly shared them at school, creating situations that were sometimes complicated, other times touching. Once, Sophie returned from school in tears because a classmate had said her mother was strange for wearing a scarf on her head. My heart broke, but I also saw an opportunity to teach her about respect and diversity. "People fear what they don't know, Sophie," I explained, hugging her. "Your classmate has never known someone like us before. Maybe you could invite her to play at our house someday." 2 weeks later, the girl came for an after-school snack. I observed, moved, how Sophie naturally explained why Mommy wore a scarf, why we had a special carpet in the living room, and why we stopped everything several times a day to talk to Allah. The innocent curiosity of the visiting child, free from adult prejudices, was refreshing. In the academic environment, my conversion continued to be a delicate topic. Some colleagues began to see me through a new filter, no longer as the brilliant anthropologist, but as the Muslim. I felt their expectations change, as if my intellectual capacity had been compromised by my religious choice. Paradoxically, this uncomfortable situation ended up shaping my professional trajectory in an unexpected way. I began to take academic interest in topics I had previously ignored. The experience of religious minorities in secular societies, the intersections between faith and science, contemporary expressions of spirituality in European urban contexts. 3 years after my conversion, I published an article titled The Inner Journey: Narratives of Religious Conversion in Secular Europe of the 21st Century. The article, which combined academic rigor with carefully anonymous personal insights, made a significant impact. I was invited to conferences, interviews, debates. Initially reluctant to expose my own story, I gradually found a balanced voice, neither proselytizing nor purely clinical. A voice that recognized both the value of scientific analysis and the reality of spiritual experience. A voice that, surprisingly, resonated with many young Germans who, as I had been, were thirsty for something beyond the prevailing materialism. "Your approach is fascinating, Professor Hoffman," commented a student after a particularly intense lecture. "You speak about religion without excessive romanticism, but also without the usual cynicism of academia. It's refreshing." These words touched me deeply. Perhaps this was my unique contribution, building bridges between worlds that rarely communicated, the world of lived faith and the world of academic analysis. Not to convert anyone, but to promote mutual understanding. 5 years after my conversion, the opportunity arose to return to Morocco, this time as coordinator of an exchange program between my university and an institution in Fez. I accepted immediately, eager to revisit the place where the seeds of my transformation had been planted. Thomas and the girls accompanied me on this trip. It was important to me that they know this part of my history, that they walk the same streets where I had witnessed the call to prayer for the first time, where I had seen people prostrated in sincere submission. Fez was different and the same at once. The Medina remained a labyrinth of narrow alleys, intense smells, and vibrant colors. But my perception had changed radically. What I previously saw as an object of anthropological study, I now recognized as part of my own spiritual heritage. The calls to prayer that once seemed exotic to me were now familiar, comforting. One afternoon, walking with Sophie and Amina through the Medina, we stopped to watch the sunset. The Maghrib Adhan sounded, filling the air with its unmistakable melody. I observed my daughters' faces illuminated by the last golden rays, as the call echoed between the ancient buildings. Sophie, now 9 years old, closed her eyes, absorbing the moment. Amina, at 4, smiled, swaying slightly to the rhythm of the recitation. "Mom," Sophie whispered, "I can feel Allah here." Her eyes shone with an understanding that transcended her age. At that moment, I realized that my journey had created possibilities for my daughters that I never had. The possibility of growing up with a sense of connection to something greater, with a spiritual anchor in an increasingly fragmented and confusing world. During this trip, I also had the opportunity to visit a historic mosque with my family. Thomas, although not converted, showed genuine respect for the sacred places. Watching him patiently explain to Amina the geometric patterns on the walls, I felt deep gratitude. Our family had found its own balance, its own unique path. Today, 10 years after that first sujood that changed everything, I look at my journey with admiration and gratitude. The path wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, of loneliness, of misunderstanding. There were tears, heated discussions, sleepless nights. But there was also a peace that transcends understanding, a sense of purpose I had never experienced before. There was the embrace of a diverse and welcoming community. There was the growth of my daughters in an environment that values both knowledge and faith, both questioning and certainty. My parents, although they never embraced my religion, learned to respect it. Thomas and I found a balance that works for our peculiar family. My academic career, far from being harmed by my conversion, gained a new dimension of depth and relevance. What began with a simple gesture of prostration, a moment of curiosity that transformed into revelation, opened a path I could never have imagined. A path that led me not only to a new faith, but to a new understanding of myself, of the world, of life. If this story spoke to you, If it touched something in your heart, I ask you to share it. Not because I want to convert anyone. Each person has their own journey, their own time, their own path. But because I believe stories like this can build bridges of understanding in an increasingly polarized world. Share this video in groups and social media. Who knows if this testimony isn't exactly the answer someone has been waiting for? Who knows if there isn't someone, somewhere, feeling that same emptiness I felt, that same restlessness, that same yearning for something more? To that person, I want to say, you are not alone. Your search is not madness. Your yearning for something beyond the material is not irrational. It is the most deeply human of impulses, the search for meaning, for truth, for the divine. And if you feel called to experience this gesture, the sujood, the prostration, do it with sincerity, not as an empty ritual, not as a scientific experiment, but as an open heart asking, is anyone there? Is there a greater meaning? Is there a truth that transcends what I can see and touch? The answer may surprise you, as it surprised me, because sometimes it is only when we bow that we can finally see the horizon. 3 years ago, I wrote an open letter to schools in Leipzig, my hometown. In it, I offered to speak with students about religious diversity, about my experience as a German Muslim, about how it's possible to integrate different identities and traditions. To my surprise, I received more invitations than I could attend. Young people of 16, 17 years, the age when I was certain that religion was just an archaic vestige of the past, asked incredibly deep and sincere questions. They weren't interested in dogmas or rituals, but in meaning, in purpose, in how to navigate a complex world without losing their essence. In one of these visits, a young woman approached me after the lecture. Her eyes revealed a familiar intensity. "Professor Hoffman," she said with a hesitant voice, "how did you know? How did you know you had found the truth and not just another illusion?" I smiled, recognizing in her the same thirst that had consumed me. "There's no single answer to that," I replied honestly. For me, it was a combination of inner certainty and external confirmation. The peace I felt couldn't come from myself. The transformations in my life, in my perspective, in my relationships, were real, tangible. And the coherence of Islam, the way everything fits into a system that makes sense both intellectually and spiritually, convinced my mind, while my heart was already convinced. She nodded, thoughtful. "But the most important thing," I added, "is that you don't need to have all the answers before taking the first step. Sometimes you need to bow first to see the horizon later." Weeks later, I received an email from her. She had begun her own spiritual search, not necessarily towards Islam. Each journey is unique, but towards something beyond the empty materialism that had characterized her education. And so, the circle is complete. The emptiness I felt in Leipzig decades ago is perhaps being filled in the next generation, not with dogmas or impositions, but with possibilities, with honest questions, with sincere seeking. That's why I share my story today, not as a model to be followed, but as testimony that unexpected paths can lead to destinations we didn't even know we desired. That sometimes the deepest answers come not from books or theories, but from a simple gesture of submission. That sometimes we need to silence the external noise to hear the inner voice. That sometimes it is at the moment our forehead touches the ground that our spirit finally rises. Salam alaikum. May peace be with you, wherever this story finds you.